Hey everyone, hope you're rocking. So just first off, just thanks to everybody who's been, sending me some well wishes after I had some minor surgery done to my neck, just to help me cope with the pain a little bit more. I've talked a lot about this on my blogs and in previous videos. So yeah, thanks a lot for reaching out, and it's always nice to know that people care. Now, in this video, what I want to talk about, I want to elaborate actually on another video that I posted, and I'll put the link below this video. I'll put some clips in this video too from that. It was just a series and a progression of sparring that we do within the Crazy Monkey Defense program, and I was highlighting the different games that we actually teach within our program. Now, one of the things that was noticeable in that sparring was that I wasn't going full out. It was what we call flow boxing. The idea is that you want to be very technical, but you don't want to be hurting the other person, right? So it's not to say that there isn't a lot of speed in there, but pulling out the power. And so the questions always are relating around that. Well, how much should you spar hard? Is it important to spar hard? What are my thoughts on sparring now? And have they changed over the time that I've been teaching? Now, I have done almost a complete turn compared to how I used to be when I was much younger. And I just want to briefly situate that, because I think it's important, because things don't just happen in a vacuum. Oftentimes when somebody talks about something, it isn't as simple as they might state it to be. It can be complex. This is complex for me because I came out of a really rough childhood. I didn't have a father figure. My mother was a raging alcoholic. I was kicked out of the house when I was 17. Many people know the story. But when I was, learning the formative kind of time, when I was learning, quote unquote, how to fight, I always felt that my life was on the line. I always felt like there was somebody out to get me. And then I spent several years outside the door. There was definitely a time where having those fighting skills were absolutely imperative. So my mindset was very different. My attitude was, you go into the gym and you blast away. You come in 100 miles an hour. You give it everything you've got. Every time I touched gloves with somebody, it was always 100%. We might have drilled nicely, but once the gloves went on, bang, we were in there and we were really tearing into each other. And at the same time, anybody that was around me, the coaches, the people who, I was hanging with, nobody said there was anything wrong with that. And so we just thought that that's the way you're supposed to train. Well, hindsight, right? So looking back on it now, were there some important things that came out of that? Absolutely. All that hard sparring taught me what I should be teaching and what I should steer away from. So I now know what works in a high pressure situation and what's not. And that obviously formed the foundation and the basis of the Crazy Monkey Defense striking based program. And it's one of the reasons why I keep kind of talking about this as well, is that when I think about Crazy Monkey Defense, it's a combat athletically based self-preservation system. So where a lot of reality-based self-defense schools focus purely on the self-preservation and do absolutely no sparring, I firmly believe that sparring is about the closest we're going to get to the reality, unless you're going to go out there and actually look for trouble every night, which nobody wants to do, right? Or unless you're in an occupation that allows you to put yourself in harm's way. Things like working the door, military and law enforcement, of course, that's different, right? So in that sense, sparring allows you this opportunity to go up against somebody that has been uncooperative, unpredictable, right? Chaotic environment. And you can create different kinds of sparring environments. I think people also get fixated on what they make this, this distinction between sports-based sparring, it's kind of how they define it, and then obviously training for reality out on the street, so to speak, right? But I can create lots of kinds of sparring experiences if I do it correctly. And so this is what I've learned over the years, and it's informed my pedagogy going forward, the way that I teach and the way that I now introduce sparring to my students. I firmly believe that though, that kind of old style mindset of going in and tearing into each other, it doesn't really do much for your game overall, other than, making you tough if you're willing to go through it, teaching you what it's like to take a shot, teaching you to get back up if you get put down on your ass. And of course, those could be valuable lessons. But a lot of times you're just trying to survive. And then when I look back at that time, although I was doing okay, I was nowhere nearly as good as I am today, which is kind of interesting. And I don't do anywhere near that kind of sparring like I used to. So it's not like I'm still coming in, every week, tearing into other people, going full out. In actual fact, I hardly ever spar like that anymore. And if I do, I try to do it and keep it to a minimum once a month. One, because of all the injuries that I have to entertain, but two, it's just not a fun place to go. And so this is kind of what I want to talk about. I want to talk about what is my fundamental approach to teaching sparring, right? And then obviously you can expand that out and just kind of look at it in a more fuller understanding of how it applies across the board in all our training. Now, one of the things that I've always noticed is that if you want to be really good at, say, the fight game, you have to be creative. You have to come up with new ideas. You have to use your imagination. You have to think of unique connections that other people may not see. And so creativity is essential part of being able to be really good at the fight game. Most people maybe not see it that way, but it is. And what happens is that creativity leads to innovation. So when I come up with ideas like all these concepts that are within the Crazy Monkey Defense program, things like riding the storm, diving board jabs and crosses, these principles, these ideas, those are innovations. Those are innovations coming out of my creative process. So the question then is, if that leads to a formidable game and basically levels you up, you need to be in a place where you are actually allowed to develop that creativity. So the next question is, what is going to be the stumbling blocks? What is going to be the thing that gets in the way of that creativity? And in actual fact, what gets in the way of creativity is the concern or the worry to make mistakes or not being allowed to make mistakes. So I've seen trainers do that where they shit on people when they make mistakes, or I've seen students too afraid to try something new because they don't want to make a mistake, or I think far more importantly that there is a consequence to making that mistake. So let's use an analogy here. Let's say every time we come in, we touch gloves, we go 100 miles an hour. We're going full out. Okay. Do you think, especially if I'm not at a very high level in my sparring game, let's say I'm a new beginner, do you really think I'm going to be creative? Do you really think I'm going to try the things we learned in the last class or try something different out the box? No ways, because I can immediately feel the intensity, and I realize that if I screw up now, if I try something different and it doesn't work, the way that this person's coming at me, there's a very, very strong chance that I'm going to get hurt. Maybe I even get knocked out. And once I've had that experience, most people are not going to want to come back. Like, why would you want to? Why would I go to a place where basically they're just pounding into me? Now, just to juxtapose that back to my formative training when I was talking about when I was younger, and I spent a lot of time in Western boxing, well, I was in a competitive gym, and there were a lot of young guys that were down and out, that were trying to make it, that were coming out of the townships, and, this was their meal ticket. This was their way out of poverty. And so they had a very, very strong desire to move themselves out of the place that they found themselves, out of that poverty. So they were willing to take whatever came their way to be able to do that. And if that meant getting knocked out or, having concussions, they would just deal with it and they would carry on. And I kind of felt like being in that environment, that was expected as well. And plus, like I said, I was always watching my back. I always, I was worried about the bullies when I was growing up. And then I was obviously working the door, and I was worried about, some tough guys taking me out. So I was, again, my reason for being there, I was willing to do whatever I needed to do to be there. But again, in hindsight, it's not actually the best way to get good and to experience any kind of, performance-based martial training. So what I'm suggesting here is much better, and so I'm going to talk a little bit more about that, right? So if you're worried about making a mistake, if you're worried about getting hurt, you're not going to be creative. But the reality is that in order to be creative, this is the thing that stands out for me. If you want to be creative, you have to be allowed to make mistakes. You have to be allowed to try something out the box. You have to be allowed to apply the tools that you learned in the last lesson. Because unless you are allowed to do that without this, massive consequence of getting totally taken out, right, and going to work the next day with your nose sitting up there and your eye completely closed shut, unless you're allowed to take those risks, you're never going to develop your creativity. You're never going to put yourself out there and try things. And so actually, I think the idea of flow boxing, which we practice in all our academies around the world, where the goal is to try to do your best. It's challenge based. You're trying to land your shots. You're trying to not get hit, but you're not putting that final oomph into it. You're still touching the person. You're still landing your shots, but it's not so much of an intensity that the person, when they get hit, they go, oh, fuck, and they don't want to re-engage again, right? And that's going to be different depending on which person you may be working with. So for example, I might have to lower my pressure quite a lot for a new beginner, maybe the speed and everything else along with it. So if I'm working with somebody with high skill, we can still do flow boxing and not hurt each other, but it's going to be faster. The tempo is going to be quicker. There's not going to be a lot of breaks in between. We're going to be moving. We're going to be very tactical about what we're applying. And we're going to get the same amount of opportunity to be creative there and build innovation into our game as we allowed the other person who wasn't up to our level when we dropped ourselves down. Because I always say, in a room, there's always somebody that's going to give you game. And you would want the same respect back from them. So when I come up to somebody who's better than me and I touch gloves, I'm hoping that they're not going to trash me from one side of the academy to the other, right? They're going to feel straight away where I am, and they're going to drop it down just enough that I still feel the pressure, because that's important. I need to feel the pressure, right? I need to feel like I'm actually having to work, because if it's too easy, then I'm not learning anything. But it mustn't be so hard that I can't apply anything, or be so concerned that if I make a mistake, I'm going to get seriously hurt in the process. So this is what I mean by this idea of flow boxing, right? It's not a full out experience. It still, has all the ideas encapsulated in that experience, though, that you need, right? So it's uncooperative. He's not telling me what he's doing, okay? He's been unpredictable. It's all over the place. He's being chaotic. He can try different things. He's going to be creative. He's going to try to throw some stuff at me outside the box, so to speak, and I'm going to have to deal with it. And in the process of that happening, I'm going to be able to build my own creativity, and I'm going to be able to innovate. And then those innovations, at least for me, as a trainer, as a coach, that then gets conveyed to the students, and that's how we continue to evolve and develop our program. I firmly believe that if I stayed in that space where it was just full out all the time, we were just banging with each other, I don't think the program would have grown. I think it would have stagnated. It would have just kind of stayed within the rudiments of pugilism, and it wouldn't have evolved into some of the key ideas that we've built into the framework of CMD that really makes it stand out and user-friendly, because that's the key, right? Is that anybody can come in and train with us, regardless of their background, no martial arts, whatever that may be, age, fitness level, and really get something out of it, because we are always deploying this attitude. Right? We want to play, basically, or challenge play is another way to look at it, right? There's the play aspect, but it encapsulates the challenge. So it's not like it's frivolous. I mean, there's a point to doing it, but the challenge isn't so high that this person cannot engage with the experience. And this is the key to really good coaching, right? It's not just about going in and banging away at each other. It's not just about going in, hitting the bag or working techniques. At the end of the day, what does any of that mean unless you apply it within the framework of some kind of resistance, uncooperativeness, right? The chaotic environment of the fight. But again, you want to do it the way that I'm suggesting, because the other way is going to stifle your progress, or you're going to have a really bad experience and you don't want to come back. And that's perfectly acceptable, right? I mean, who would want to? Unless you had the reasons like I had when I was growing up, or those other fellow boxers that I worked with where they were trying to pull themselves out of poverty. Most people are not going to deal with that, right? And it's just not enjoyable. Also, most importantly, the way that I'm describing the way that we are sparring in this video is I can come back and do it every day. I can do it 3 times, 4 times, 5 times a day. If I want to do 6 rounds every time I stepped on the mat for 3 times in a day, it's not going to be a problem, because my head's not going to feel like it's shifted its axis, right? And it's going to minimize injuries. And we now know that you don't want to be taking that force to your head, right? So it's not good for your brain long term, even if you're just doing it just as an average person. I mean, you could go and spar just as an average person for a couple of years and do some serious damage to your brain and not know it until much later when you're older. So this is also, from a health perspective, it makes a whole lot of sense to spar this way. And then, of course, like I noted right in the beginning, every now and again, you can ramp it up a little bit with somebody that you trust, and then you can go a little bit harder. What do I mean by that? Because if suddenly I'm making stupid mistakes when he kind of dials it up, closing my eyes, pulling my face away, trying to run away from the punches, well, that's way too hard and I can't handle that. He's going to have to pull that back a little bit so that I can actually stay in the fight. Because if I'm running away, flinching like this, pulling away from it, I'm not learning a damn thing. And I'm just now basically creating really bad habits that are going to be very difficult to get rid of later on down the road. So even when I say go hard, it doesn't mean go hard in the sense that now you're going hard, but your whole game falls apart. You still have to be able to keep the game together. And if you can do that, then the intensity is not a big deal, because that means that that's the intensity you can actually handle. And that's the key. You must be able to handle it. Otherwise, you just, like I said, you're going to develop really bad habits and it's going to be bad for you in the long run. So hopefully that, kind of clarifies some of just the basic idea of the way that we approach sparring these days compared to how we used to. And like I said, it's a massive learning curve, and we're continuously developing new sparring drills and applying this idea to other different things. And I can do it in self-preservation training too, when I want to set up a specific scenario. We do that all the time, where we'll say, okay, we're gonna deal with this kind of situation, but the person's going to come out and they're not going to necessarily tell us what they're going to do, and you're going to have to respond. And that person must continue to fight back, but we can do it in a very similar way to we do our sparring, right? The flow boxing, where it's going to be, there's going to be the speed, there's going to be all the tactical stuff, the technical stuff that you need to deploy, but you're still going to be able to stay within the fight and do what you need to do without now worrying about getting seriously hurt. So that you are there, even in that environment, in the self-preservation environment, able to build your creativity, which will lead to your innovation. But just remember, none of that's possible if you're in an environment that you cannot make a mistake, either because you're told not to make mistakes, or you won't allow yourself to make mistakes, or crucially, making a mistake means you're going to get hurt. That's probably the number one reason why people don't want to be creative in their martial arts game.